What would you do if a personal tragedy felt so intentional, so targeted, that you decided to sue the devil himself? Well, today we're diving into an incredible story where that's exactly what happens. This is the trial of the Tempter. So let me just ask you this straight up. Can you actually take the devil to court? Sue him? It sounds like a joke, right? But as we're about to find out, one person absolutely believed the answer was yes, and they were ready to go all the way to prove it. And this quote right here is the absolute heart of the story. It's this deep conviction that there's an invisible, invulnerable enemy out there, and that this enemy isn't just a spiritual problem. No, they believed it's a legal one, a being that is actively breaking our laws and hurting real people. So how in the world does a lawsuit against a supernatural force even get started? Well, it doesn't begin in a stuffy law office. It starts with the very real grief of a teenage boy. Yeah, the whole flight kicks off with a 16-year-old kid named Evan. And for him, you have to understand, this wasn't some abstract philosophical debate. This was personal, deeply personal. Evan's mom passed away from smoking, but in his mind, it wasn't just the addiction that killed her. He was convinced it was what he called a tempting voice, a voice that just wouldn't let her go, constantly pushing her to keep smoking. For Evan, this turned a terrible tragedy into what he saw as a cold-blooded crime. So, with this absolute conviction burning inside him, Evan's private grief is about to become a very public and very, very unusual call for help. So what does he do? He takes out a newspaper ad, an actual ad in the paper, asking for a lawyer to take on what he calls a seemingly absurd case, for free, pro bono. But then comes the line that stops everyone in their tracks. He claims he has actually captured this enemy in a small black box. I mean, let's just put this into perspective for a second. In a normal case, right, you have a defendant you can see. You have evidence you can hold. In Evan's case, the defendant is the tempter. The evidence is an invisible influence, and the capture, well, it's a dude in a box. The big question wasn't just if a court would hear this, but how could it possibly even try? You would think an ad like that gets you nothing but crank calls, right? But against all odds, someone takes it seriously. An old retired lawyer sees the ad and he picks up the phone. And why? Why would he take this case? Well, get this. It wasn't just pity for the kid. The lawyer says that throughout his entire career, he's felt that same invisible force, that he's heard that same voice whispering suggestions while he was defending criminals he knew were guilty. For him, this was a chance to finally face an enemy he'd been fighting in the shadows for years. Okay, so we've got a grieving son with a mission, we've got a lawyer who's on board, but now comes the biggest hurdle of all, trying to convince a real judge to actually hear this thing. I mean, just picture it. The lawyer walks into a courtroom in Livingston, Montana, holding a file for a case against the tempter. On paper, this is something that should be thrown out in, 5 seconds? It's completely absurd, totally outside the court's jurisdiction. But then, the unthinkable happens. The judge agrees, and her reason is just wild. Just like the lawyer, she says she's also felt this additional force at play in her own courtroom. She saw this trial as more than just a legal case. It was a chance to send a message, to declare that the good guys wanted a change. And just like that, it's happening. A trial against the tempter is officially on the books. Now, the court has the bizarre task of figuring out the actual rules for something that has never, ever been done before. So, first things first, how do you even define the defendant? The judge makes a really critical ruling here. She says, for the purposes of this trial, the tempter is defined as the enemy of God, the Lord of evil. And this is the really important part. They weren't going to waste time trying to prove his existence. For this trial, his existence would just be assumed as fact. And here's how they justified it, which is pretty clever. The judge basically says, look, we accept invisible forces all the time, right? Like gravity or love. We can't see them, but we sure can see their effects. So the court decided to apply that exact same logic here. If the tempter's effects are real, then he can be put on trial. All right, so the defendant has been defined, his existence is accepted by the court. So what exactly is he being accused of? Well, the prosecution doesn't hold back. The charge sheet is huge. It starts with a very specific crime that kicked this whole thing off, the premeditated torture and murder of Evan's mother. But it blows up from there. to include everything from being a false teacher to leading gangs to being a master manipulator behind countless other crimes. So the trial is ready to go. The charges are all laid out. But just before they begin, the judge adds one last rule. And it's a monumental challenge that raises the stakes to an almost impossible level. And there it is, the knockout blow. To get a conviction, they have to convince all 12 jurors, unanimously. And the standard of proof? Beyond a shadow of a doubt. So the question is no longer just, can you sue the devil? It's how in the world could you ever win?